Hello, Andrew here. Welcome to Lecture 5 in the Using Creative Multimedia for Youth Engagement module. This lecture will look at queer discourse in digital multimedia. Much like the previous two lectures on feminism and race, we can only really get some sort of a snapshot or build a frame around this because it's such a vast and growing subject in terms of just the amount of theoretical frameworks, just the different and varying roles that media intersecting with legislation and just people's individual choices and how they seek to identify themselves. All these things becoming a going and growing concern. So we try to build a historical framework around that and look through some media lenses and then look towards gaming and new technology and social media and the likes, just to give us an idea of how far this discourse has come. So historically, if we want to look at homosexuality, I suppose, in culture in general, it's got a very vast and broad sort of standing and establishment across a myriad of cultures. Most cultures would have artifacts or elements surviving, pointing to individuals or cultures where homosexuality would have been embraced and part and parcel of that culture. So we look at one of the first homosexual couples recorded in history comes from Egypt, dating back to the year 24,000 BC, before Christ. There's much debate about whether or not this is a true homosexual couple, but there is a historical kind of context that it's set in when it was discovered, when the depictions were discovered in a nose kissing pose, and Munir Basta, the British chief inspector that would have discovered this image in the tomb in 1964 in Egypt, was surprised that he'd not seen this depiction of two males before, and the tomb being built for two men to cohabit. So that all kind of does point to this being regarded as the first homosexual couple in recorded history. Almost virgin on mythology, we have the Sappho, a long-standing history of being a symbol of female homosexual communities. It's both sapphic and lesbian, Sappho being from the island of Lesbos, and these variations on her name being used to describe homosexual women throughout time, being a massive, having a massive impact. In the Tang Dynasty in China, again, we have the incense brother, the hero, and other synonyms for homosexuality. In that dynasty, it would have been part of the culture as well. If we look towards I can't the Kajuharo monuments of India, well known for their erotic sculptures and this sort of different homosexual takes on relationships, and just being sort of such an established part of the culture and part of the history that it's depicted in any number of monuments and sculptures in this particular area, but in other areas of India as well. And then we look kind of more recent times, I suppose, towards the North American Indians, who would have used the term two-spirit or two-spirited, a modern pan-Indian umbrella term to be used by some indigenous North Americans to describe people in their communities who fulfill a traditional third gender or other gender variant roles in their culture. And again, this being this idea of a third gender being an established and included gender within the community as well. So we look at this. There's any number of historical frameworks for that show how cultures and communities of people would have embraced and accepted homosexuality as a norm rather than, you know, some sort of other, which once we talk, we'll get onto the discourse of, you know, more contemporary media, or, you know, more contemporary societies, and how the depictions of this and how this has kind of come across. So if we look again, we're looking towards, like, you know, a more stereotypical image or shorthand in the grammar that would happen in media depictions of lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, and queer individuals, often representing them as visibly and behaviourally different. Media representations of bisexual and transgender people tend to either be completely absent or depicted as morally corrupt or mentally unstable. In the United States, gay people are frequently used as a symbol for social decadence. So just those three elements alone, just, you know, do outline a vast amount of even contemporarily how you know, LGBTQ individuals would be represented. Historically, again, this would have all pointed, like, and in a number of countries still, where, you know, we have like religious conservative countries in particular, where LGBTQ individuals are persecuted, forced into exile, murdered, or, you know, there's or forced kind of to live really secretive existences because it's such a taboo in the cultures that they still live in. So, you know, again, we'll look at that a little bit later, but just to kind of point out that those stereotypes have kind of descended on mainstream media depictions in particular, and you know, just to, again, we'll use that as a frame kind of going forward. So I'm going to just go to the first video, which is just a brief sort of history of those sorts of stereotypes in media and in cinema in particular, and then we'll come back after that. Okay.
Something amazing happened last week. The Supreme Court of the United States made gay marriage legal. Go time, right? Well, I think part of the reason that this took so long has to do with how homosexuality has been portrayed in our culture. So with that, let's take a look at the history of homosexuality on film. You're looking at the first instance of homosexuality on film ever recorded. Made in 1895, the film demonstrates that the social norms around male interaction were far less stringent than they became in subsequent decades. That's why Jack can kiss David in Wings back in 1927 without people getting up in arms. That film actually went on to become the very first Best Picture winner too. Yep, by the same Academy that denied Brokeback Mountain the award 78 years later. During this period, as long as one maintained one's proper gender role, same-sex affection was allowed and even celebrated. The first half of that sentence is pretty important because there still is the misconception that being homosexual and being transgender are the same. They're not, which is what defined the pervasive stereotypes about both gays and lesbians at this time. For gay men, the stereotype was the pansy or the sissy. In other words, an effeminate man, someone who should be ridiculed. Like how this man does when he sees Charlie Chaplin kissing what he thinks to be another man. The sissy is a character that appears as the background dressing of numerous films throughout the 1920s and early 30s in oddly specific ways. The color lavender, for example, was unequivocally a sissy color.
I designed the costumes for the show, not the doors for the theater.
I know that. If you hadn't even got a lavender.
The female counterpart to this was the mannish woman, usually wearing a men's suit, men's hat, and having slicked back hair like a man. In Morocco, a woman performs on stage wearing a tuxedo and later kisses a woman. But these kinds of explicit lesbian interaction were rare. Even in Morocco, the kiss only happens for a moment, and then she spends the rest of the film pursuing Gary Cooper's character. But then the Great Depression happened, and film studios became desperate to get people into the theaters. So they shocked the audience with violence, nudity, and homosexuality. It basically became HBO. Cecil B. DeMille's biblical epic, The Sign of the Cross, is a great example of this. Emperor Nero has a slave boy who is his implied lover. The Empress demands to be disrobed by women, and in one scene there is a woman-on-woman erotic dance. But all of that didn't sit well with several Catholic and Protestant groups who organized mass boycotts against these kind of films. The Catholic Church even created a group called, I kid you not, the Legion of Decency, to publicly oppose abnormal sexuality on film. This led to the creation and later the strict enforcement of the Production Code around 1934, which which heavily censored what could and could not appear in Hollywood movies. You see, back in 1915, the Supreme Court had ruled that films did not have First Amendment rights. Movies, they said, were primarily a business and could be censored by the state. Preempting state laws, the industry created its own regulation backed by the tastes of religious groups. This resulted in some pretty outlandish situations, like the plight of Samuel Goldwyn when trying to adapt the play The Children's Hour. The play is about the rumors of lesbianism between two teachers at an all-girls school. In the movie, it had to be changed to two women fighting over a man. And not only that, the title had to be changed to These Three, as the original was thought to be too well known as a lesbian work. In other adaptations, homosexuality is similarly erased from the story. The film version of The Lost Weekend swaps out sexual confusion for writer's block. The Brick Foxhole, a novel about homophobia, became Crossfire, a movie about anti-Semitism. The character of Joel Cairo in The Maltese Falcon is a homosexual in the book, but that had to be smothered in subtext in the movie. But the filmmakers found ways to sneak it in. I mean, why do you think he's fondling his cane so often in the film? One strategy was to have the man married to mask his homosexuality, like in Top Hat. Here the men even kiss while the wife looks on.
Oh!
Go right ahead, boys. Don't mind me.
But what was the easiest way to get a homosexual into your movie? Make them irredeemably villainous. Preferably a Nazi. There's the Nazi on the house on 92nd Street who turns out to be a woman in drag, the Nazi in Saboteur who is effeminate, and then in another Hitchcock film, Rope, the villains are two homicidal homosexuals who speak sensuously about the pleasures of suffocating a man.
I felt tremendously exhilarated. How did you feel?
It's not just the suffocation that gets them excited. Probably the first example of this is the sneering villain Waldo Lydecker in Laura, who was explicitly gay in the screenplay. Laird Krieger basically made a career out of playing psycho queers in I Wake Up Screaming, The Lodger, and Hangover Square. Meanwhile, lesbians were obsessive and creepy, or hardened prisoners. And just like most movie villains, the homosexuals in these films almost universally died by the end of the movie. In Rebel Without a Cause, a gay man is ostracized by his friends for his sexuality and eventually killed. In Suddenly Last Summer, a gay man is killed by a mob. Yep, a gay on screen had a shorter life expectancy than a red shirt. So not only did the production code erase homosexuality from the American consciousness, it burned it in effigy again and again and again. In 1952, the Supreme Court reversed its decision, giving films the right to free speech. Meanwhile, the production code was torn down piece by piece as studios became less afraid of church boycotts. Of course, this didn't immediately improve the representation of homosexuals on film. Instead, the old archetypes morphed into something more sinister, self-hating, suicidal homosexuals. In Sergeant, a gay man kisses another man. He later commits suicide. In Advising Consent, in 1962, a gay man cuts his own throat. And when The Children's Hour finally got an adaptation that could bear its title, the main character hangs herself after allegations of homosexuality, which were of course true.
Oh, I feel so damn sick and dirty. I can't stand it anymore.
In all of these stories, the homosexual characters are told so often by others that they are wrong and filthy that they start to believe it. And by extension, the audience starts to believe that as well. Hollywood had succeeded in helping people hate homosexuals. Now it helped them to make them hate themselves. But then in 1969, Stonewall happened. Members of the LGBT community demonstrated against a police raid in New York, opening America's eyes up to the plight of homosexuality. In Hollywood, it dawned on producers that they could make money by aiming films to the homosexual community. Boys in the Band was the first effort in this vein. It features a cast of gay male characters, but even its writer admits that it is colored by his own self-esteem issues as a result of the constant negative images of being a gay man in popular culture. But after this, and along with the sexual revolutions of the time, the 70s became a great moment for homosexual cinema. Sunday Bloody Sunday, Midnight Cowboy, Cabaret, and Making Love were all huge leaps forward in depicting homosexuals and homosexual romance on screen. But these advances were rolled back in the 80s, at least in the mainstream. Religious boycotts made a comeback. Film historian Vito Russo estimated that Death Trap lost $10 million after it was leaked that Alfred Pennyworth and Superman share a kiss on screen. That's one expensive smooch. On top of that, gays were the focus of intense hatred because of the AIDS epidemic. And once again, we see the gay as villain stereotype in film, as in Cruisin'. Meanwhile, several low-budget independent films, including Born in Flames, Mala Noche, Parting Glances, and She Must Be Seeing Things, all presented a new queer identity, and led to what critic B. Ruby Rich would call the new queer cinema that began in the early 1990s with films like My Own Private Idaho, the documentary Paris is Burning, Poison, and The Living End. Films of this movement presented represented groups of outsiders who embraced non-traditional lifestyles. For them, identity and sexuality were fluid, changing things, not rigid black and white ideas as in decades prior. Of course, Hollywood smelled money and pumped out a series of Disney-fied queer films in the late 90s. Homosexuals became campy comic characters, often in drag. An exception is Philadelphia, which came out a few years prior and examined the struggle of living with AIDS. But while gay people in mainstream film could finally be portrayed as good people, people that we didn't laugh at or pity or fear, we still rarely saw them engage romantically. Tom Hanks and Antonio Banderas never kiss in Philadelphia. That is until this happened. It is impossible to understate how important Brokeback Mountain is in the history of homosexuality on screen, and to the history of film in general. It presented a true romance between two men, two fully fleshed out characters, neither of whom are killed in ways that the audience is meant to cheer. It was nominated for 8 Oscars and won 3. It didn't win Best Picture, but it didn't need to cause a seismic shift in the public perception of homosexuality. So if there's one thing to take away from this history, it's this. Fiction matters. How we represent each other in media changes the way we think about each other, how we treat each other, and ultimately how we govern each other. But the second lesson is that history is not a linear thing. We didn't just become more progressive about homosexuality over the course of a century. It was a roller coaster. The sissy archetype of the 20s was by no means positive, but at least it was visible. That's more that could be said about the repression caused by the production code that followed. The films following Stonewall in the 70s hinted at a step in the right direction, but that was countered by fear-mongering around the issue during the 80s. It's an ebb and flow of progressivism and conservative reactionaries, and the battle is never really over. So share this video with someone who supports gay rights, or better yet, someone who doesn't, because the only way this golden age of queer cinema will continue is if we learn from the history that got us here. My name is Sage Hyde, and thanks for watching.
Okay, so yeah, pretty, exacting and articulate snapshot of, a history of representation in film in particular. And, an interesting point to pick up in there is that sort of, obviously the rollback and the kind of the ebb and flow between progressive and conservatism. And, since film has kind of come along, there are one stage being far less stringent depictions before having to kind of present things in a subtext sort of format, or once as we see in America where the code was introduced and everything was kind of forced underground, I suppose. The other thing is just how acceptable it was even in early cinema in relation to once it sitting within specific gender roles, that being male and female, between the sissy boy and the mannish woman. And that's something that has kind of, we'll speak about in a while, how that's kind of turned on its head with the concept or the issues with gender being sort of raised over and over again, and we'll get to that next. But also just to see how to point to it doesn't same as the last lecture in race, we're talking about representation and how building up a grammar or a stereotype or shorthand within film and sort of dramatic or creative fictions can feed into a popular kind of consciousness or a popular discourse of how homosexuality in these instances was perceived. And in the news media, coupled with, say, an AIDS epidemic and easy sort of, platforms to be opposite something, news media generally predicted, would have represented homosexuality as it was rarely explicitly mentioned, and it was often portrayed as a sickness, a perversion, or a crime. So we see that this sort of, again, like previous, this concept of the other, again, of something. I wanted to flash this up just to kind of, bring that to mind of an individual who's perceived by the group as not belonging. and as being different in some fundamental way. And, you know, this kind of accounting for sexual orientation as well as all the other sort of, you know, forms of othering that we can and have discussed elsewhere already. And all of this sort of feeding into, you know, a really unhealthy sort of frame for and a damaging, violent, criminal sort of frame that has happened and over again in recent times, with just, you know, homosexuality being illegal for a start, and this in countries when it's met with sort of a kind of a conservative religious position being a really brutal sort of existence to have to kind of live in. So we'll kind of talk about that again in a little while, but I just want to kind of move on and put another theory in there, which is the concept of queer theory, and about how this is kind of, you know, coming from academic spheres, but mostly in relation to radical movements, to bring a broader understanding and an awareness around the multiple sort of aspects that are at play here, not simply like, you know, gay, lesbian, or homosexual movements, but also in relation to feminism, where this would have arrived from, and the queer theory in particular from De Laurentiis' proposal, Teresa De Laurentiis, who in 1991, in her work as a feminist cultural studies journal, Differences, she came up with the title Queer Theory, Lesbian and Gay Sexualities, where she was explaining her term to signify that there are at least 3 interrelated projects at play within her theory, or this theory, because it is a broader sort of thing where it was taken from different areas. Refusing heterosexuality as the benchmark for sexual formations, as a challenge to the belief that lesbian and gay studies is one single entity, and as a strong focus on the multiple ways that race shapes sexual bias. So there's just 3 really key core elements to this of, you know, one thing is how an individual would identify, how that is accepted in a broader sort of mediated representation, how that becomes internalized, and how all of that is at odds with, you know, a person's lived experience and how they think and feel. So, and even as simply as that, to be kind of, you know, for lesbian and gay studies to be a single entity in this sort of simple, in this Fermat example, where basically we see that there's this sort of an erosion of what is perceived as, you know, a normative behavior, and how the society and cultures kind of present things opposite that. So we can see that this kind of brought in any number of areas, from gay and lesbian movements, AIDS activism, sexual subcultural practices such as sadomasochism, and even extended as far as like things like post-colonialism and, you know, race, you know, at that sort of extremity of it as well, and how all these things, you know, intertwined with the radical movements of people of color and, you know, gay and lesbian movements. Excuse me. So, you know, queer theory is just like an umbrella, I suppose, that can be put across all these very disparate, different, and emerging sort of theories and areas that were long overdue some study and research and a bit of due attention in particular ways. So I'm just going to put on the next video here, which is we just want to expand on the idea of gender being a social construct, really, and about how, you know, what would be regarded as normal, and, you know, the heterosexuality being the benchmark as normal sort of, you know, conceptions of gender, to just challenge that and expand on that, and then we get into some sort of examples of where this is being challenged as well.
When I was a kid, I used to try to get my sister, an avid feminist at the time, to react to comments like, in general, men are stronger than women. It would usually work, and my short-lived laugh turned into an hour-long argument. She always said that men are just socially conditioned to be stronger than women, and while I never argued against the fact that society pressures certain groups of people into doing certain things, for example, men lifting weights, eating mouthfuls of whey protein, and injecting themselves with male hormones, I also would argue that the biology between men and women is different. Just look at our bodies for one. As much as I would love to have a set of fun bags on my chest to play with, it would just never happen without the injection of female hormones or plastic surgery. You see, one of the problems with the question of whether or not gender is socially constructed is that the people who answer it most passionately generally overlook the arguments on the opposing sides. Feminists tend to disregard many biological factors, while naturists tend to overlook sociocultural factors. Hello everyone, Thought Monkey here. Today we're going to explore both sides of the argument of whether or not gender is a social construct and try to come up with some kind of conclusion. First, some history and background. Gender is a term that was created as a way to differentiate between biological sex, whether or not you have an Italian salami or a hoo-ha, versus the psychological, social, cultural, and behavioral characteristics associated with being female or male. In recent years, many social scientists have begun to believe that gender identity is not a stable and fixed trait. They argue that it is socially constructed and can vary over time. Some have even argued that there are more than two genders and have created additional classifications by using terms such as cisgender, transgender, genderqueer, non-binary, gender fluid, agender, etc. Anyways, the two competing ideas about whether gender is a social construct come from the familiar nature versus nurture debate. In other words, is it our environment that makes us who we are, or our biology? Those who say gender is a social construct often argue the following. Number one, there are differences in gender norms in different cultures. For example, there are subcultures in India that identify three genders, and in Chile, some believe that you must channel another gender to accomplish certain tasks. The list goes on. According to the academics Candace West and Don Zimmerman, gender is an emergent feature of social situations, both as an outcome of and a rationale for various social arrangements, and as a means of legitimating one of the most fundamental divisions of society. By the way, I looked up Candace West on RateMyProfessor.com and she only got 2.1 out of 5. Would you eat at a restaurant that got such a low Yelp score? I didn't think so. Old Don didn't do much better. Another argument on the nurture side of the debate is that language forms our reality. The words man and woman are simply words to describe certain phenomena, but don't describe every option or experience of all people in our culture. Phrases like be a man or boys don't cry are used to pressure boys into conforming to traditional masculine gender roles, while run like a girl and other women-centered phrases pressures girls into behaving in a way that is considered traditionally feminine. Others say that gender is a feature of nature, not nurture. They say that being exposed to testosterone and estrogen will make the way we behave inherently different. For example, there are studies that show male babies and female babies behave differently given different stimulus. Male babies tend to stare longer at mechanical objects, while female babies tend to stare longer at faces, which may explain why women and men tend to find themselves in different career paths. Men often gravitate toward science and engineering, while women toward healthcare and education. Another argument is that the reason some women and men identify as a gender opposite of their sex is because sometimes nature has hiccups. For example, some female fetuses are exposed to large quantities of male hormones and develop something called congenital adrenal hyperplasia, a fancy term for a disease that may alter the sex organs of people. Also, there are members of the trans community that believe gender is biological. Some trans women have stated that while they were brought into this world as men, from the get-go they felt biologically that they were women and thus behaved as a woman. Their argument is that if gender was socially constructed, then as a boy who felt like a girl, they would have been socially pressured into feeling like and behaving like boys. However, despite being socially pressured into feeling like boys, these transgender women have always felt like women despite their sex being male. Another argument is based on the story of a boy named David Reamer, whose circumcision went horribly wrong. He was given sex reassignment surgery at 22 months old and was raised as a girl named Brenda. Brenda was given girl toys but always seemed to gravitate toward more traditionally boy toys. Eventually, as a teenager, she expressed suicidal thoughts to her parents, and her father told her what had happened. Despite the female hormones and socialized pressures to be a girl, Brenda identified as a male and changed her name back to David when she was 14 years old. Years later, David started treatment to reverse the reassignment given to him as a 22-month-old baby and married a woman. Unfortunately, years later, after battling with a failed marriage and depression, at 38 years old he killed himself. This shows that despite the social pressures on David of his parents and doctors to identify and behave as a girl, he still felt like a boy. Those who argue nature over nurture also say that men and women are inherently equal, but different in biology. Their environment and society plays a part in how we behave, like how boys are given blue and girls given pink, but most research shows that biology is the reason there are major differences in how each gender behaves. Because of this, society follows biology, not the other way around. Women have less sexual partners because there have been more severe consequences for choosing the wrong mate, birth, and then at least 15 years of caretaking. Society then stigmatizes women who don't follow a biological norm because our brains are wired for 100,000 years ago, not for a society that has technology that allows us to practice safe sex, where choosing the wrong mate no longer bears the consequence of a life followed by years of caretaking. Finally, if there are differences in how each sex looks, there must be differences in how we behave. Males tend to have more muscle mass than women, probably due to the amount of testosterone that they have. The hormones in a man's body must have an effect on their brains and how they think, thus how they act. Similarly, the amount of estrogen in a woman's body must have an effect on a woman's brain, how they think, and thus act. Of course, there are exceptions. Some women are going to have more muscle mass than some men, and some men will want to act more as a caretaker than some women. So now that you have heard the arguments on both sides, what is the solution to such divergent ways of thinking? Should we categorize every difference of every individual into different genders? I think most people would disagree, as that would lead to more divisiveness and complications. Why would it help to have to classify more people into different categories and learn more terms? Language has historically simplified itself, not the other way around. So instead of breaking male and female up into 7 or more classifications, why not just simplify it even more? Instead of being male and female, let's all just be ale. Oh wait, that's already a word. Whatever, can't we all just get along, agree to disagree, agree there are some differences that are biological and some that are socially constructed, and just get on with life? After all, there are more important things to deal with, like finding a good affordable restaurant nearby when a friend is in town visiting. Thank you for listening. Please hit the thumbs up button below if you enjoyed the video, and subscribe to stay updated for more Thought Monkey content.
Okay, so, it's just an interesting short video there just to expand on this kind of this concept of gender being a social construct, or, bringing up all these really loaded debates of nature versus nurture. This kind of pushes of being progressive versus conservatism and the rollback on these sorts of issues once it kind of it emerges as like a vital part of how people live, want to live, and conduct themselves, and how that is kind of embraced or repelled by the norm of a heteronormal society, I suppose. One instance of this, a more recent one, just kind of flag an element of this sort of it kind of emerging into the public domain in a way that hadn't been considered, and becoming a bit of a divisive issue, where being defined or having to kind of define yourself is in the bathroom bill, which is kind of it's an ongoing sort of this discussion in America, where state by state there's really kind of disastrous or very different approaches to how this can and should be legislated for, and basically all it really points to of how inclusive you are of transgender individuals in the society in any particular state, so it also points to the details of, or sort of it gets into the detail of the rights of transgender individuals accessing public facilities, and how determinist this has to be in relation to their sex or how they identify. So you can see how kind of, in one way, how radically progressive this is, and at the other time, at the other step, how instantly loaded and how conservative a response or a backlash to this can be in a lot of instances. So it's that sort of duality of it, and the bottom line being that people are going to live their lives how and identify as they will, and it's up to the society to kind of extend itself to include everyone. So that's kind of a very simple issue, but I just wanted to kind of to point to this sort of bathroom bill to just show that sort of where it buffets up against where people's lived experience and how they actually are living and identifying and doing it publicly then buffets up next to what is regarded as normal, and then how that's kind of challenged as a result. I just wanted to put in a slide about a history of queer cinema, or just cultural, where a cultural understanding of queer cinema and the different elements of that, or lived experiences through that, have kind of come out. And this in and of itself could be a whole module, so we're not really going to cover a lot of it here, but it does certainly need to be addressed. And there's any number of luminaries who've made really interesting cinema in and of its own right, cinematically, and then also in terms of describing and depicting the lives and realities of every vein of LGBTQ individuals and the societies and cultures that they've had to live in and continue to live in, and then how unique an expression it is in the same breath. So, as I said, a whole module could be done on this, and many of these filmmakers are vital to the history of cinema, never mind queer cinema. We look at the likes of Derek Jarman, Rainer Werner Fassbinder, who's actually he was a director, but he's an actor as well, and this is him on the floor in the toilet covered in blood in the image at the bottom. Kenneth Anger, who would be a really important figure in gay cinema. And then we've like Divine in the character Divine and John Waters' Pink Flamingos. Chantal Ackerman, really important filmmaker, depicting lesbian relationships, or lesbian filmmaker such. So, and then if we look towards, a whole emergent sort of, an ongoing sort of cinema from, world cinema. I suppose this is a really interesting thing to get when we talk about queer cinema, more than everything that we've kind of discussed right now has been sort of from a ethnocentric sort of Western queer sort of understanding, and a Western gay identity politics, whereas, that's only one frame, both contemporary and historically, through which to look at any of these issues. It just happens to be the most dominant one in what I'm discussing here in terms of new media, I suppose. But we can see, films and filmmakers like R.A.S. Solito, Tsai Ming-liang from Taiwan. And I suppose I wanted to put this sort of element to just talk about communal film consumption occupying a privileged space in queer sort of culture and queer longing. And I suppose that just kind of points to this, the fact that, being queer, being homosexual, being outlawed, criminalized, demonized, made taboo, stigmatized, and kind of pushed underground or into back alleys and, exiled. And all these elements kind of arriving at, the importance of clubs and membership, or, different sort of sadly more clandestine or secretive ways to, identify with other people, be it LGBTQ or whatever your sexual identity or your own sort of person, how you would identify. And the cinema kind of playing a really important part throughout the history of it, really. And that's really all we can get out of that. As I said, there's a module that could be done on this topic alone. It's an incredibly rich vein of cinema. But I suppose that's all. I just want to kind of to wave a flag about the sort of the Western identity politics side of this, and how that doesn't represent globally, and also just sort of, the private versus the public element of this as well. So to kind of push forward, I suppose, and where, it's kind of arrived at in terms of acceptability, we look at, and visibility in particular, and just kind of offloading negative media attention around it. We look at, pride parades being accepted, being sort of forms of activism and really sort of changing the culture and raising a different type of discourse around the world in major cities and smaller cities, and even in towns and villages by now. And at the same time, this sort of queer and gay cinema existed in festival and, just in a broader sort of ongoing annual events, or monthly events in certain areas, where it's become a form of campaign in and of itself, and to just mostly for this all to kind of to add visibility to the plights and the human rights and the acceptance of everyone, and how and a respect for how they would want to identify. So again, just with back to the kind of flipping back to the Western sort of identity politics end of it, I suppose, we just look at how this is totally fully assimilated within popular culture, in particular with the likes of RuPaul, Ellen, series like The L Word and Queer as Folk, which have run for 10, 15 years now, maybe even more, and how that has just kind of assimilated into the popular culture now. Again, just to kind of flag that, really, to show how far it has already come. Then in an Irish context, I just want to show this video, Panty Bliss's Noble Call, which galvanised the marriage equality referendum in Ireland. So we'll just watch this first, and then I'll comment on that.
Tonight, we are delighted to welcome to the stage Ireland's most fabulous drag queen and famous activist, Panty.
Hello, my name is Panty, and for the benefit of the visually impaired or the incredibly naive, I am a drag queen. I am also I guess a performer of sorts, and an accidental and occasional gay rights activist. As you may have already gathered, I am also painfully middle class. My father was a country vet. I went to a nice school, and afterwards I went to that most middle class of institutions, an art college. And although this may surprise some of you, I have always found gainful employment in my chosen field, gender discombobulation. So the kind of grinding, abject poverty that we saw so powerfully on stage tonight is something that I can thankfully say I have no experience of. But I do know a little something about oppression, or at least oppression is something that I can relate to. Now, I am not, of course, for a minute going to compare my situation to Dublin workers in 1913, but I do know what it feels like to be put in your place. Have any of you ever been standing at a pedestrian crossing when a car goes by and in it are a bunch of lads, and they lean out the window as they go by and shout "fag" and throw a milk carton at you? Now, it doesn't really hurt. I mean, after all, it's just a wet carton, and in many ways they're right. I am a fag. So it doesn't hurt, but it feels oppressive. And when it really does hurt is afterwards, because it's afterwards that then I wonder and worry and obsess over, what was it about me? I mean, what did they see in me? What was it that gave me away? And I hate myself for wondering that. It feels oppressive, and the next time that I'm standing at a pedestrian crossing, I hate myself for it, but I check myself. to see what is it about me that gives the gay away, and I check myself to make sure that I'm not doing it this time. Have any of you ever come home in the evening and turned on the television and there is a panel of people, nice people, respectable people, smart people, the kind of people who probably make good neighborly neighbors, the kind of people who write for newspapers, and they're all sitting around and they are having a reasoned debate on the television, a reasoned debate about you, about what kind of person you are, about whether or not you're capable of being a good parent, about whether you want to destroy marriage, about whether or not you're safe around children, about whether or not God herself thinks you're an abomination, about whether in fact maybe you are intrinsically disordered. And even the nice TV presenter lady that you feel is like almost a friend because you see her being nice on TV all the time, even she thinks it's perfectly okay that they're all having this reasoned debate about you and about who you are and about what rights you deserve or don't deserve. And that feels oppressive. Have you ever been on a crowded train with one of your best gay friends and inside a tiny part of you is cringing because he is being so gay? And you find yourself trying to compensate for his gayness by butching up a little, or by trying to steer the conversation onto safer, straighter territory. And this is you who has spent the last 35 years of your life trying to be the best gay possible. And yet there is still this small part of you that is embarrassed by his gayness. And I hate myself for that, and that feels oppressive. And when I am standing at a pedestrian bloody light, I am checking myself. Have you ever gone into your favorite neighborhood cafe with the paper that you buy every day, and you open it up and inside is a 500-word opinion written by a nice middle-class woman, the kind of woman who probably gives to charity, the kind of woman who you would be totally happy to leave your children with? And she is arguing over 500 words so reasonably about whether or not you should be treated less than everybody else, about arguing that you should be given fewer rights than everybody else. And when you read that, and then the woman at the next table gets up and excuses herself to squeeze by you and smiles at you, and you smile back and nod and say, no problem, and inside you wonder to yourself, does she think that about me too? And that feels oppressive. And you go outside and you stand at the pedestrian crossing and you check yourself, and I hate myself for that. Have you ever turned on the computer and you see videos of people who are just like you in countries that are far away and countries that are not far away at all, and they are being imprisoned and beaten and tortured and murdered and executed because they are just like you? And that feels oppressive. 3 weeks ago, I was on the television, and I said that I believe that people who actively campaign for gay people to be treated less or treated differently are, in my gay opinion, homophobic. Now, some people who actively campaign for gay people to be treated less under the law took great exception to that characterization, and they threatened legal action against me and RTE. Now, RTE, in its wisdom, decided incredibly quickly to hand over a huge sum of money to make it all go away. I haven't been quite so lucky. And for the last 3 weeks, I have been lectured to by heterosexual people about what homophobia is and about who is allowed to identify it. Straight people have lined up ministers, senators, barristers, journalists have lined up to tell me what homophobia is and to tell me what I am allowed to feel oppressed by. People who have never experienced homophobia in their lives, people who have never checked themselves at a pedestrian crossing, have told me that unless I am been thrown into prison or herded onto a cattle truck, then it is not homophobia. And that feels oppressive. And so now, Irish gay people, we find ourselves in this ludicrous situation where we are not only not allowed to say publicly what we feel oppressed by, we're not even allowed to think it, because the very definition, our definition, has been disallowed by our betters. And for the last 3 weeks, I have been denounced from the floor of the Oireachtas to newspaper columns to the seething morass of internet commentary, denounced for using hate speech because I dared to use the word homophobia. And a jumped up queer like me should know that the word homophobia is no longer available to gay people, which is a spectacular and neat Orwellian trick, because now it turns out that gay people are not the victims of homophobia. Homophobes are the victims of homophobia. But let me just say that it's not true, because I don't hate you. I do, it is true, believe that almost all of you are probably homophobes. But I'm a homophobe. I mean, it would be incredible if we weren't. I mean, to grow up in a society that is overwhelmingly and stiflingly homophobic and to somehow escape unscathed would be miraculous. So I don't hate you because you're homophobes. I actually admire you. I admire you because most of you are only a bit homophobic. And to be honest, considering the circumstances, that is pretty good going. But I do sometimes hate myself. I hate myself because I fucking check myself when standing at pedestrian crossings. And sometimes I hate you for doing that to me. But not right now. Right now, I like you all very much for giving me a few moments of your time, and for that, I thank you.
Okay, so you're really eloquent and important in terms of like contemporary Irish history around the equality in marriage referendum, which then happened. This noble call from Paddy did certainly help galvanise that and explain a lot of the internalized or oppressive elements that happen, and as far as victim blaming, that have kind of these kind of new phenomena attach themselves to understandings or whatever level of discourse happens around discussions of inclusion and how people want to identify or see themselves. Elsewhere, Panty talks about things as simple as not being able to hold hands in public and show public displays of affection, and that these sorts of they really point to how sort of shocking and outmoded and outdated a lot of like the popular discourse and the sort of public acceptance of people and individuals are in many countries, even in quite, seemingly advanced sort of societies. And, all of that sort of adding up to a form of solidarity, I suppose, can be easily offered to that and outwards from that in terms of like how would one individual want to be perceived in relation to what is considered normal or what is considered acceptable, and kind of expanding on that, Thankfully, though, in the Irish context, this came to pass, and we have with the referendum for equality in marriage, and mostly by popular vote, which is the most interesting part about this, where the referendum was passed by 62% to a no of 38%. that this being a really sort of significant event, something that has kind of reverberated internationally and in other countries and continues to do so, and to raise the level of discourse and the debate or discussion at very least around this. On the left here we have Catherine Saponi and her partner Anne-Louise Gilligan, who had been married and had fought since 2003 to have their legal recognition of their Canadian marriage recognised in Ireland. So, that having come to pass, and Senator Catherine Saponi at the time, now currently a sitting minister in the government. So, all of these things kind of point to a profound significance and a change with how things are conducted, and in an Irish context, and how people are allowed and accepted for who they are and how they want to live their lives. And that being something passed by, a popular vote is a very interesting sort of and significant, profound change that can happen as a result of that. So I just want to kind of skip past that to just talk about a few other ideas, I suppose, around how media is depicted, how media does and continues to depict different sort of, gender identities, really, with this. So we look at gender queer being an identity, akin in some elements to something like androgyny, which has been a part of popular culture and, say, in terms of the fashion industry for a long period of time, where that being an expression of it, where, meaning that a person of any gender can be androgynous, and androgyny is usually related to the way you dress, although, there's other reasons for that, but there are other elements that could form the expression of androgyny. But the difference with gender queer or non-binary being that it's an identity, and that there might be a combination of masculinity and femininity, or neither, which is kind of closer to the androgynous expression. And just the interesting thing about this, I suppose, is just how it can mean different things from person to person, and how you can use it how it can change or be fluid and change from one day to the next, and that being like a really sort of a personal choice of how you want to identify and exist. And that's, kind of opens up a whole other element of discussions around like queer discourse and media. And one element of this, I suppose, is if we look at the conceptualization of gender as something that's performative. When we look at individuals who are non-binary gendered individuals, and a lack of a media repetition of non-binary individuals, because it is in flux and it's so specific and bespoke to each individual, that this concept of gender being performative, where it has to exist in a form of repetition over and over again before it's kind of visible or gains traction through its visibility to have advocates for it, or acceptance of. And this being a kind of an interesting realm that social media has kind of brought us to, where people have the capacity to perform their gender, for want of a better word, or to kind of reassert it and assert it a different way and again, and kind of have some sort of, and live their existence that way. So we look at, individuals like Jeffrey Marsh or Ruby Rose, who would use social media in quite a big way to reassert or to alter these sort of performative aspects of how they want to identify on any particular day, and that being their right to do so. And then historically, we look more sort of the androgynous side of it. There's any number of precedents in popular culture, in particular, mostly with, say, the likes of David Bowie, who would have presented and expressed himself as androgynous through many sort of different personas publicly. So we can see that this is something which used to be unique and one sort of one small sort of unique aspect of a pop star sort of public persona now being available to every individual to kind of conduct their lives as they would like through the use of new media technologies and different sorts of different ways of expressing themselves and having a sort of a repetition to themselves in relation to that. How much of that just kind of how much of that relates to like sexual identity politics and advocacy in absence of like human sort of, in a broader sort of human sense of the advocacy of is something to kind of just worth noting there, that, you know, how much of your identity forms who you are, I suppose, next to the culture and the societies that you live in. And that's just kind of something where, you know, it's interesting that these types of debates can now happen on that level. So I just wanted to kind of flag a few ideas around that, and then just on to talking about the last sort of the last bastion of like masculine heteronormative society being just sports, essentially, you know, and male dominated sports, and you know, very particular versions of that in, say, in American culture. Where this quote quite sums it up in a way: perhaps no single institution in American culture has influenced our sense of masculinity more than sport. So again, this sort of needing and requiring to be challenged, and, you know, to be more inclusive or accepting of other people, or likewise even homosexuals within these these particular sports or sporting industries, which there are, you know, which of course there are, but it's a case of having to, you know, it's still being a taboo, still carrying a set of stereotypes, still being kind of off limits or something not to be touched upon. And even as far as female athletes and the depiction of female athletes, where, you know, Harden would write about the female athletes being presumed to be lesbian, you know, and thus media outlets being reluctant to cover women's sports in general, in particular those sports perceived as more masculine in nature, such as hockey and rugby and other areas. So there's, you know, there's a whole other element there that needs to be unpacked, and where sports have kind of brought back into this sort of discussion and domain about people being able to identify and being accepted for who they are and how they want to be and live their lives. And sport not being, you know, an area where this can still be taboo. So 2 last slides really just about in terms of gaming then to talk about it, because it's quite interesting as well there. It's obviously more recent, but it's definitely the domain of games and, you know, the media format of gaming being much more inclusive of different versions of gender or identity, where basically you know, the very nature of playing a game is you inhabiting a persona per se, and just playing within a game in a particular role and being able to change or alter that and sort of experience anew like that. So it's a bit of an interesting sort of, you know, platform in that regard. Here we have the first sort of lesbian themed computer game, Caper and Castro, which was assumed lost for a great number of years in this turned up. I'll have a link to it there, so anyone who's interested in looking at or kind of, you know, discussing around this, because it's really interesting that this is like as in gaming sense as early as 1989, but in another way quite late on, I suppose, and it's worth looking at in that regard. And then in terms of just broader sort of, you know, gaming and depictions of characters in general, where it's a little bit different to how we would have looked at like more stereotype versions of characters in games from, say, when we were talking about race. Now we have something which is a little bit different, where we have more complex characters like the likes of Ellie in The Last of Us, or, you know, the game like Dragon Age Inquisition. The Dorian character in that is a gay magic user. And this being, you know, in one way, obviously, you know, in terms of the visual grammar of it, depicting cinema, I suppose, and those sorts of tropes a little bit more. but obviously being, the room to exist in multiple versions and to be ambiguous about gender and allow the player to kind of explore different ends of it is something really interesting about gaming in particular. And we look elsewhere, we look at like Zero in Borderlands being a non-binary sort of character and the language of the game and how that's all depicted and played in the grammar around that, depicting as such. And a really interesting one for mine is Frisk in Undertale, referred to throughout in gender neutral pronouns. And overall the game Undertale kind of, being based around the concept of empathy and, having that sort of a more intimate sort of sensibility to it where the emotions are at play in a very different way and gender not being the defining element of that, I suppose. And then we look at a game like Overwatch and Blizzard's Entertainment's kind of, revising of that game or updating of the next, version of it to include more LGBT characters. And, this idea of diversity and inclusiveness of all types being central to that is kind of interesting here, as in we have, a whole update for the game just featuring LGBT characters and, given multiples of heroes or different versions of it. To quote, the lead writer, Michael Chu from Blizzard Entertainment, is that we want the stories about characters' relationships, and not just romantic, but familial relationships and stuff like that, to come out in the course of stories that we feel really do them justice. It's something that's absolutely is important to us. So, we can see that gaming is definitely a really interesting sort of area where multiples or variants or different experiences or ways of experiencing yourself or how your perceptions of your own identity and others and all that being in like different sort of dynamics, be it familial dynamics or, whatever version of that. Gaming's a really interesting platform for all that to be expanded upon and discussed. So as I said, that's just kind of like a snapshot of things really. It's any end of that could be taken on and ran with to any degree. And there's a lot of really interesting theory and, different sort of illustrations and examples of older norms being challenged by newer versions of newer, more progressive changes and like expressions and acceptance of people and how they want to live becoming a norm again. So I'm going to leave it at that really. The next lecture will be on development discourse and digital multimedia. Any questions you might have about that, or if there's anything you'd like to discuss or have more information on, please drop me an email and I'll be sure to get back to you there. Okay, thanks very much. Bye.